Hello, welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about Game of Thrones Season 8. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
Well, it's pretty simple. On this podcast, we like to talk about games. But, unfortunately, there is a meteor heading for the popular culture, and it's the end of Game of Thrones. So I don't even think we could avoid it if we wanted to. Obviously, Mango has been dutifully watching the entire series in its final year in order to get the full season finale experience.
And I regret it 100%. This is your fault, buddy.
Do you?
You did this to me! No.
What is it, like 78 hours or something?
73.
Content, I guess.
Well, I guess it might be 78 with the extra minutes on the end. Like the later seasons were a little bit longer, but or the individual episodes, not obviously the number of episodes, because there weren't enough of them.
So for the last 10 years, the culture has been absolutely dominated by Game of Thrones. It has been the biggest show, not actually for all of it. Some of it has been The Walking Dead, but it's certainly the biggest show now, breaking all kinds of like crazy records with the finale and everything like that. Unfortunately, the finale has broken some other records, which is to say that people really hated it.
Number of hearts.
Yeah, it's currently sitting at like 4.4 on IMDb, much of which I just have to assume are like salty 1-star reviews or whatever. But let's just say the series finale didn't go over that well. But we're here to talk about it today.
Yeah, and there will be spoilers for all of Game of Thrones, possibly some of the books as well, things that weren't in the show. And we'll talk about that. But before we get too deep into that, I wanted to, so the records that it broke, I saw something that said that like it had like 19.3 million viewers for the finale, and then somebody posted that like Frasier had like a 60 million viewer finale. So like maybe it's not as big as we all think it is. Like it definitely dominates like our culture, right? Like the nerdish culture stuff, but I don't know if it penetrates as much into the mainstream as maybe we think it does.
I've seen some conflicting information on this. Part of it is just that TV viewership has gone down a ton with like streaming and stuff like that.
And piracy, right? Like
yeah. And so I think it's a little bit harder to kind of like track it. But in the modern era, 19.3 million people is like, cataclysmic, huge numbers. It
is a lot. Yeah, I won't say it's not. And everybody knows about, like, my dad called me and asked me what I thought about the finale of Game of Thrones, and my dad is not the type of person who cares about any of that. He's like, yeah, I heard the sports guy talking about it on the radio. I was like, okay.
Wow.
Yeah. Right. So, it definitely does have that impact. But I guess with that, we will put the official spoiler tag here. So if you want to go be disappointed, go watch Game of Thrones.
Yikes. What a way to start it, though.
Am I lying? Is it not true?
I mean, we're past the spoiler tag, so we're both in the same spot, right? Like, this was a really disappointing end to the series. I imagine that we're going to come at this from fairly different angles in the specifics, but I think the overall sentiment that I have heard from basically everyone is the exact same. The writers stopped caring, and they rushed through everything, and that just ruined the whole show, essentially, in the last couple of seasons. A very common sentiment that I have heard, and that hits really close to home to me, because this describes me perfectly, are kind of like the apologists who are coming around to being like, what the fuck was I thinking? Like, there is a lot that I was willing to forgive about Game of Thrones, just because I assume, you know what I mean? Like, I was like, it's hard. This is hard work. And I get that it's not going to be perfect, and I'm okay with that, and I'm willing to kind of, like, be forgiving. But the more that's kind of come out, and the more that we've seen, and the fact that there is no, like, pot at the end of this rainbow, there is no landing, they're not interested in sticking it, they're not interested in caring, really, that has soured not just this season, but my thoughts on my thoughts on the series as a whole. We're not here to talk about the series as a whole. We're here to talk about the series finale, which is aptly called The Iron Throne. But is that like a fair assessment of things? You think I'm like nailing like, you know, how Twitter feels about Game of Thrones?
Yeah. You know, like I said, when my dad described to me what the sportsman on the radio thought of the Game of Thrones finale, it's basically that. In terms of your other point about being soured on the whole thing, I think that's like a more common thing than we normally talk about, and I think that's like why a lot of like you get like these split opinions on things. Where if somebody starts to tumble, they start like looking backwards and finding things they don't like. We've talked about this before, right? Like I think this is largely what happens with like The Last Jedi.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
And a lot of these other movies that have like vitriolic hate bases that are opposed to the fan bases, right? That you know, you notice when it starts to fall, you start nitpicking apart the other things that didn't work, and the things that you previously were willing to forgive just all come out in kind of like the cavalcade of criticism. But I do think it is particularly bad here because you can feel it kind of like you can feel it seeping out of the episodes. Although I might say that I am more willing to attribute this to like, you know, D&D. D&D were always hacks. Like I noticed the fall off happen pretty sharply after they got off the book material, and I think somebody
D&D being Dan and Dave, the showrunners on the show.
Yes, and
not Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes,
another frequent topic for
you're
some
absolutely
Derps
right. That's actually been funny to see because everybody keeps calling it D&D, and like the occasional comment that's like, are you talking about like tropes that like Dungeons?
Yeah, right. What did wizards do now?
You know, I just think that maybe they weren't ever that good in the first place, and they were really carried by the George R. R. Martin writing. In a lot of ways.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that. Another thing that someone pointed out that I think is very apt, to be honest with you, is that George R. R. Martin himself was kind of a member of the writing staff, and for the first couple of seasons, he had writing credits on specific episodes. But as they got away from the books, and as George wanted to get Winds of Winter out, he kind of stepped back a little bit. And I also think that, it's not just they got away from the books. It was, at the beginning, the author was really clearly, affiliated with this project, and he was pretty hands-on with it. And at this point, you can kind of tell that he sort of wasn't. There's also just been some reporting that come out that is just like, oh, so damning, right? Like, for instance, with season 7, I was willing to give a lot of sort of leeway to the show because of how massive it had gotten, right? And I understand that if you're an HBO executive, right, and you have this giant sprawling show and you have to put big giant CGI dragons, and now you're getting into all these battles with the dragons to pay off, you didn't have to worry about that stuff in season 1. You have to worry about it a lot now in the later seasons. And on top of that, right, like people like Amelia Clarke and Lena Headey and, Nikolai Coster-Waldau and, Kit Harington, these guys know that they are at the top of the biggest show on television, so they have a lot of leverage to bleed you dry. So, like, I was kind of like, listen, you know what I mean? It doesn't just become the biggest show on television for nothing, and that I could see it kind of collapse under its own weight, right? Like HBO is like, listen, it's going to be millions of dollars an episode. Doing 7 makes a lot more sense than 10. But the reporting that has come out has since contradicted that. HBO was willing to funnel as much time and money into this series as they wanted. And Dan and Dave both said no. They wanted the truncated back half, the truncated last 2 seasons, and we just kind of had to put up with it, I guess.
The theory is that they wanted to get onto Star Wars, which they have been granted a trilogy for. So, Disney ruins everything again, I guess.
And part of me doesn't want to open with this stuff because we don't I think that this is all useful context, right? But it is really tough to go right after the creators themselves in a kind of personal way. I really hate getting personal when we talk about this stuff. I want to talk about the work. I want to critique, the media. But I feel like with Game of Thrones, you just kind of cannot avoid it. It is baked into the DNA of what has been happening for the last couple of seasons.
I think part of this too is I didn't watch them, but I know that you did, and that a lot of people did, and were very aggravated by them. Are these post-episode explainers by D&D that had some stuff in them that people were like, "Are you kidding me?" Like the famous quote is, I forget what the original context was, but X kind of forgot about why.
Danny kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet, which literally doesn't make sense because in the episode, they are at a war council where Varys says Cersei has the Iron Fleet, and he takes a token and puts it in Blackwater Bay, which is where Dragonstone is located. So it's like they're not even paying attention to their own show, right? And that's just tough, like that's a tough thing when you're this invested in a project, right? Like part of my the overall Game of Thrones experience, I think, for a lot of people has been waiting 2 years between seasons, right? Like waiting a year to find out that Sandor Clegane, no, longer than that, 2 years to find out that Sandor Clegane had not died as the Hound and was still alive as the the Gravedigger character. That was like a huge reveal. That's not something that's quite caught in a way by truncated viewing. So there's a lot for people to get invested in, kind of year over year, and the time and the theories and all this other kind of stuff. So to have the kind of bottom fall out of all of that stuff is just woof.
Yeah, and in kind of a similar vein, people point out that there are children named Khaleesi and Daenerys whose parents were 7 years old now, whose parents are like, "Oh no, what did I do? What did I do?"
Yeah, okay. So obviously Daenerys is probably the good place to start because she starts off the episode. Daenerys is absolutely devastated King's Landing. And she's just a fucking crazy person now, I guess. Okay. And then Jon Snow murders her in the throne room, and then Drogon melts the Iron Throne and carries her off.
All right.
Poochie.
So I want to know, first things first, whether you subscribe to the Drogon understands metaphor theory, or the theory that Drogon thinks that the chair murdered her because he doesn't understand what swords are.
To be honest, I kind of don't really subscribe to either of those theories. My personal interpretation of that moment was that Drogon understood that Jon was a friend. You know what I mean? Obviously he had been around Jon a whole bunch. Jon rubbed his nose in season 7. Jon understood that Drogon, because Drogon didn't witness it, right? So Drogon understood that Jon was a friend and was just kind of lashing out, and the lashing out happened to be metaphorical. There is some textual evidence in the books, for instance. A bunch of the maesters think that the dragons are actually really, really smart.
It gets mentioned in the show. That was actually my initial thought too, is that
oh really?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily that he was going for a metaphor, but that it especially the part where he where Drogon cradles basically Daenerys' body. That was a real kind of intelligence thing to me. But I think some of these moments were well done. I thought Drogon flying off with Daenerys' body was really well done. That should have been, I've elucidated this other places, but I think that should have been the end of that episode, right? And then we get another episode or two of denouement because it was just so powerful and so well done. And there was the fade to black there too. I was like, did the episode end? And then I looked at it and there's still half the episode left. And I was like, I thought that was the natural end point for that episode.
Yeah, I mean, my overall impression is that Danny got done really dirty. I don't think... I mean, part of this is that I am a Danny fan, right? And there are a lot of, Danny fanboys who are being... the Danny stands are simultaneously, kind of out in force and also getting piled on. Which, it's a whole thing. I think that this is an appropriate end in the broad strokes, but the specifics of it are just absolutely heart-wrenchingly brutal to anyone that, went through 7 seasons of Daenerys like, yeah, I'm on board with this woman, and then kind of got season 8. Like, Daenerys is treated as literally, like, this is the part that kills me. The text literally positions Daenerys as worse than Tywin and Cersei combined. Like, Tyrion, who is kind of the ultimate winner of the Game of Thrones, and we'll get into that, right? But, like, Tyrion says that to Jon. He says, you know, if you count up Daenerys' body count and compare it to my father, who is undoubtedly an evil man, and Cersei, who is undoubtedly an evil woman, they pale in comparison. And so the idea that, like, the show isn't saying, oh, Daenerys is Icarus. You know, she flew a little too close to the sun, right? Or she's like, or like Stannis or like Ned, right? Any of these tragic heroes who have these flaws that kind of ultimately lead to their undoing. It's like, no, Dany is black-heartedly evil. Like, what an awful thing to do to that character. Do you know what I mean?
So I see what you're saying, and I think this is the thing I think I'm gonna keep coming back to. I think that was the right place to go with the character, but the pacing was bad. And I think that lots of the issues you can have with the characters in this final season can be said, the pacing was bad, the pacing was bad, the pacing was bad. And I think a lot of characters were done dirty by this.
No, so I definitely agree with that, but you think that it was appropriate that Dany was regarded as an absolute monster with no redeeming qualities whatsoever.
So I think that that you wanted to be built there, and she becomes like kind of like the tragic villain, right? Like the thing that keeps popping into my head is like a Stalin or something, right? Like somebody who starts out with like aspirations of the for the people, but eventually just turns into a monster. But I don't think you wanted to do that over the course of 5 or 6 episodes.
I think like Stalin is the wrong answer for that, but I guess I understand sort of where you're coming from in a way. I think that's a difference. I think Dany wants to end as a sort of tragic hero more than a tragic villain, and I was really hoping to get like some silver lining, right? Like I basically laid out a couple of different things that I felt like the show should have done to kind of just give Dany a little bit of credit, right? Because it just seems ludicrous to me that people like Jon and people like Tyrion would look at Dany with so much contempt, right? I mean, Jon, to his credit, says, you know, like, it doesn't feel like the right thing to do or whatever. But then Tyrion is like, oh, no, it was absolutely the right thing to do, dude. I was completely blinded by how much I wanted to fuck her to realize, you know, like, how awful she was, which, again, I also think is, like, a terrible, just absolutely awful way to kind of, like, you know, kind of position the character. But I think that there are things that they could have inserted, right? Like, some kind of notice that Slaver's Bay is doing well. Right? That she came to Slaver's Bay, she conquered Marine, Astapor, and Yunkai, and legitimately changed these people's lives for the better, right? Or something along the lines of, like, you know, Dany getting a little bit of credit for the ultimate breaking of the wheel that Tyrion says has happened, but that, like, you know, Dany did give us the better world, she just couldn't live in it. You know what I mean? Like, she was the last tyrant that had to die for us to get here. You know, like, any of those kinds of things, I feel like I would have been much happier with. There is a version where we don't get the same 7 seasons of buildup, and she is more kind of uncomplicatedly evil, if that makes sense.
I think there's also a version where like, you're right, but, like, the things that Tyrion said are painted that way with the camera work, right? Like, if the show doesn't show her things that are that were kind of atrocities in the previous season, like, paints them as a little bit more as atrocities and less like her ultimately being right? Like, they do a little bit of it, but, like, you know, like, you can have, like, say, the burning of the calls, right? And, like, have them, you know, like, focus on them screaming and maybe show Daenerys smiling at them or something. And you start to paint her in that way.
Definitely. Because it's also part of why I feel like, you know, I mean, somebody described this idea that, like, at the end of the Battle of Winterfell, they, like, subbed out Daenerys with a faceless man. You know what I mean? Because she was such a completely different character. And I think there's a nugget of truth in that, in the sense that, like, it does feel entirely out of character. Like, it is This is the point I made on the podcast last week. It is entirely out of character for Dany to wantonly, like, murder innocent people, right? Because one of the foundational aspects of her character that has been fundamental from the beginning is this, like, compassion that she has for common people. That's the whole point behind, like, Slaver's Bay and everything like that. And so, like, part of it is, like, a redesign of the end, but also part of it is a redesign of, like, the battle itself and giving Dany a better reason for, killing, for raising the city than she had, which was, there was no reason. She just did it because she's crazy, like, apparently. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I like I said, I think there are other ways you could have done that too, right? Like, I think that there's, if you want to do the mental gymnastics, there's like a version of this where Dany didn't really care that much about the common people. She cared about their adoration, which the ones in Slaver's Bay were willing to give to her, but the citizens of King Landing were not willing to give to her. But the show doesn't really paint it that way. Like, the things that Tyrion says to kind of justify what Daenerys has become ring true, but only in a factual way, right? Like, the cinematography and storytelling, I guess is the best way to put it, of the show has not painted her that way, even though you might have a fridge moment at some point and be like, hey.
No, I definitely think that that's true. Like, so for instance, something that I called out in a previous episode, the moment in the crypt when Tyrion and Sansa are talking to one another, and Sansa's like, you have these divided loyalties, like, we could never be together because of it. And she says, like, that's the problem. And then Missandei goes, no, without the Dragon Queen, there would be no problem at all. I feel like that is also a piece that's kind of just, like, missing in the show. Season 7 was very good, and all prior seasons were very good about putting us in Dany's head, if that makes sense, right? Like, and we understand where she's coming from, and we see her point of view. Whereas I feel like in Season 8, we only ever really saw Dany through other people's eyes, if that makes sense. We never got to kind of get back into her brain and figure out her thought processes in order to like really understand them in a way. Like, so, so it helps create this picture of, well, Dany is a huge villain, but the truth of the matter is that she just didn't get time with the audience to continue the empathy that she had been given for 7 seasons prior, if that makes sense. Like, it is ludicrous to me that Cersei Lannister gets a more, like, empathetic death than Dany does, where she's, like, crying and pleading and all of this stuff, and it's framed as this, like, this real, like, tragedy, where it's like, Cersei is unquestionably the worst character, like the morally most vile character in this series, I feel like. And so the idea that she is treated with more kind of like emotional respect than Daenerys was, that, like, I feel like all of these things kind of like interlock together into my, like, Dany got done dirty point.
So I don't know if I agree with you that Cersei gets a more emotionally respectful ending than Daenerys. Like, I think the moment where Jon, says, you're my queen you're my queen forever and always, or whatever, and then stabs her, I think that's pretty emotionally resonant. So I don't know if I completely agree with you, just kind of on some of the facts there, but I definitely see your point. And I will say that something that thinking about it is, I have been vocal in kind of my viewing of the series, has been discussing with you that I wasn't a big fan of Daenerys. Mm-hmm. But I will say that, like, as this was happening, I assumed that she was going to get a happy ending because the show was painting, like, I was having these fridge moments where I was like, she's just a brute that everybody loves, and, she gets a pass because she's, quote unquote, doing the right thing. And I thought the show was going to give her a happy ending because I thought that's like, they didn't ever indicate anything to the contrary that she was bad, even though I personally thought that her actions were bad, right? Like, this is essentially like the inverse of a Thanos did nothing wrong type take, right? Like, right. And I'm satisfied with where they. I don't want to say I'm satisfied with where they went with the character, because again, I thought it was I thought the large kind of plot points were what I wanted out of Danny, but they weren't they weren't story told right, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, so I want to come back to this thing in the throne room, because the reason that I feel like it was different with Danny is I felt like that throne room scene wasn't about Danny at all. It was all about John.
That's
like
fair.
Something that I have talked about a little bit off the cast is this turning of Danny into a plot object, right? This object of the plot that kind of just does things so that the other characters can react to it. This was kind of like most like loathsomely put in the episode prior, like the idea that the devastation that Danny causes is not motivated by herself. He's not motivated by her kind of psyche, right? She is just a plot robot fulfilling a plot task so that the violence that is inflicted upon her in the next episode is like therefore justified. And that violence is not depicted from Danny's point of view, I don't think. I think it is depicted from John's, because we have we have John's view into all of this. We don't have Danny's. And that like that's kind of what I'm really like getting at when I talk about, the difference between her death and Cersei's death, right? Like that was Jaime's moment as well. And I mean, I also think that they just mangled the shit out of his character too. But I think really that moment was about Cersei. It was just about like this little twinge, this tiny final twinge of this incredibly loathsome, contemptuous woman, where we were just like, man, that fucking sucks. You know what I mean? Like, and so that's the contrast in my head, kind of, to these two things. But we've talked a lot about we've talked a lot about Danny, but we should probably hit on some of these other characters. John being a pretty good example of them. How do you feel about all of this stuff in the final episode when it came to John?
John? So John's tough, right? Because like, I think John had some good emotions around him. I think so. I guess what do you think? What do you think John's ultimate fate is? Because I have been of the impression and the understanding, and is that he has rejected his demand to go to the Night's Watch, and he's going beyond the wall to be a wildling. I don't think he's necessarily going to be the next Mance, right? Like I could see that being a plotline for a theoretical sequel. But, like, that is not the explicit... Like, he is not going out there to be the next Mance. He is just going to be a wildling. Whereas other people say that he is going to be the... that he's too duty-bound, he's too honor-bound to be... And so he's, with the Night's Watch, he's just helping them settle. But, to me at least, it is much better if he has... Like, killing Danny has so broken him that he is no longer that person, and he is willing to forsake his duty to just go be a wildling beyond the wall.
Yeah, that is exactly what... Well, that's not quite exactly what I think happened, in a sense. But I definitely think that he went to go be a wildling. And I also think that the Night's Watch kind of... like pushed him in a way, like that thing where he looks back to the gate and then watches the gate close. To me, I read that as John expected the gate to be open and he was going to go back through, but then like his brothers in the Night's Watch were like, no, go be free, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? So it's a little bit of like what's the called? It's a little bit of a Call to the Wild moment where it's kind of like, don't live out a prison sentence for doing the right thing in the Night's Watch. Go be free among the free folk, kind of thing. I also think that there's there's a certain amount of like, John is obviously very, very connected to the Night's Watch. He's always loyal to the Night's Watch and everything, but he does spend a large amount of time with the wildlings and is very connected to the wildlings, which is something that people kind of like misunderstand. John very, very clearly truly loves like Ygritte, right?
Yeah.
And he truly empathizes with the wildlings, like with the wildlings' plight. So I think it makes a lot of sense that like he would end up with he would kind of like break his vow or whatever and end up with the wildlings over the Night's Watch because, if you really look at it, like the Night's Watch were not really all that great to Jon.
Yeah. No, especially they killed him, right? Like,
yeah.
I thought it was going to be a much more explicit when he got rezzed. I thought it was going to be much more explicit, like, my duty is until death, and I died.
That is something that remains a foggy mystery to me as far as this show goes. Like, I cannot believe that they did not spend more time on the fact that Jon literally died and got resurrected.
Yeah, I mean, they drop a lot of these threads, especially the more mystical ones, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely, right? Like, I don't know.
Like, what happened to the warlocks, right? They tried to assassinate Dany with the kid, and then we never heard from them again.
Yeah. In the books, Karth comes back into things with Meereen, and it's like part of the politics of Meereen, but that doesn't really... Yeah, that is a very weird thing. I absolutely kind of agree with you. When it comes to the weirdness around certain kind of like dropped plot threads that kind of just sort of like go nowhere. That actually kind of leads me to the next character that I wanted to talk about a little bit, which was Arya, because what the fuck was the end of episode 5
with the
if
horse?
All Arya does is have like a 5-second conversation with Jon in the midst of all of these other conversations he's having with all of these other people, and then she just like pieces out from Westeros forever. Like, did they let me put it this way: did they really end season 5, the penultimate episode of their series, on a red herring fake out? Yes or no? Like,
I mean, I think the answer has to be yes.
Right? Right? What the fuck? Oh god!
Like, that's probably the like. What was the horse? What was she doing? Why, she never uses her faceless man stuff ever again, right? Like,
yeah, right. What is that? I have to say, I really expected Arya's finale to be like a downer a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, we talk about the bittersweet ending, and obviously, like, Dany gets a downer ending. A couple of characters kind of get, like, downer endings or whatever. But for the most part, a lot of people get, like, really uplifting ones, right? Even people, like Jaime, who ultimately kind of relapses to Cersei and everything like that. He gets his awesome page in the fucking, like, white book. And I was expecting some of that stuff to be offset by two things. The first thing I was expecting was Tyrion to die because he could not honor his promise to Bronn, and he just finally couldn't repay his debts, and he gets fucking, like, killed. And then the second thing that I thought was going to happen was Arya was going to be killed by a faceless man. That's kind of like the long, like the long-awaited kind of comeuppance from, like, abandoning their, like, their whole thing. But that did not happen. Basically, everybody got a pretty happy ending, except for Dany, it felt like, in Season 8, Episode 6.
Yeah, and honestly, I still can't... I was so certain she was going to get a happy ever afterlife with Drogo. And it didn't happen. I was so surprised. Because that was another thread that they dropped, right? Like, they had her see him in, like, wherever that was. Like, some wizard's house in somewhere.
The House of the Undying at the end of season 2,
Yeah. But, like...
I mean, I would argue that she deserves that, I would argue that she deserves that happy ending because, like, even though she was awful at the end or whatever, there's a lot of real good that Dany brought to the world, right? She basically single-handedly made the difference when it came to the, like, the Battle of Winterfell. And as Missandei says, without her, there would be no problem at all, kind of thing. Though that is a contested point. Some people are like, well, fucking Arya would have just done it anyway, which is kind of whatever. But I think if more people had gotten downer endings, I would be a little bit more content with Dany's downer ending. Like, if Tyrion had been killed by Bronn, if Arya had been killed by, like, the Faceless Men, but Jon gets a happy ending, Sansa gets a happy ending, Bran gets a happy... You know what I mean? Like,
I don't think Jon gets a happy ending. I don't think that's fair.
You don't think so?
No,
okay,
I think
that's fair. Yeah, okay, that's actually fair. I'll agree with you. I think Jon gets... He gets the most mixed bag, if that, like, he is... I do agree with your point that he is kind of, like, legitimately emotionally hollowed out by the whole experience.
Yeah, kind of along these kind of happy ending things, something I want to talk about are the jokes, because I hated them. And not because they were bad jokes, because they were good jokes. Like, they were funny jokes, but they had no place in this episode at all. Especially just, like, kind of how they were placed, and I hated them so much. Like, you know, I'm normally not on your whole, like, Bathos is terrible train, but, like, this just, I couldn't get, like...
I don't even think, this wasn't even Bathos, right? It was just so off time, you know, like, oddly timed, I felt like.
Fucking, like, both jokes at the council, Tyrion arranging the chairs... everything in a small council, right?
I don't think that those jokes are Bathos. I think the purpose of those jokes is to kind of be like, oh, it's back to business as usual. Tyrion is jokey and Bronn is jokey or whatever. But I just like, you know, it just felt so crazy in comparison to the devastation that was in, it's not even just the previous episode, but in like the previous 10 fucking minutes. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Especially the small council stuff, because that's right after Danny dies, right? Like,
yeah.
And like, I almost would have been happier if they had gone with the democracy, like actually embrace democracy, because then it would have been just so bad that I could have just laughed at it. Like, we were it was going, I'm like, is it really going to be this cheesy? And then it was like in service of a bad joke, and it was just like, what? Like, why? Why did we do this? Like, why was this part of the discussion? Like,
yeah, I don't understand how they made that decision in the writers' room. Like, who was there that pitched that and like everyone signed off on it? Do you know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Because to be honest with you, even the democracy ending, like the democracy ending at least would have like made more sense than the ending that we got, because you could at least kind of end on all monarchs are despots, right? And awful and terrible, and like the only answer is to abolish monarchy and embrace, you know, like representation of some variety, right? Whether or not you want to call that democracy or whatever, or like or what have you, constitutional monarchy, whatever, you know, like whatever form it kind of takes. Just the idea that, like, you know, having this absolute power concentrated in the monarch, in the hand of the king, XYZ, these things are bad. But they didn't end there. They kind of like half did it, because I guess they're not going to have hereditary monarchy anymore. They're just going to once in a lifetime oligarchically elect a despot. I'm just so confused. Do you know what I mean? Like,
I feel like this has to bring us to the big steaming pile of shit in the middle of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is King Brandon Stark.
Oh God. Okay, here's my core thing about Brandon Stark. This one's easy, so I'll get it out of the way. The core thing about King Bran that is stupid is that it completely defies sort of the logic of the series, if that makes sense. The logic of the series is that when a succession crisis happens, people will, you know, like inevitably devolve into infighting and warfare and intrigue in order to gain power for themselves, right? Like, this is the premise of the show. Robert dies, and then we have a succession of instability, right? And so the idea is that, okay, we end on Daenerys solidly assuming control of the Iron Throne, but then she dies, which throws us back into a succession crisis, and it just gets resolved by a bunch of people who have never met Bran before in their fucking lives saying, what?
Yeah, and believing, like, you know, believing whatever the three-eyed raven is, and doing it, it's not even on, like, good logic, right? Like, if there was some, like, you know, some appeal to, I don't know, like, he's like a true-born Stark or something, he's nominally got some experience, or, like, you know, even if it's unbelievable, you say, well, he's got the experience of every ruler because he can see them all, right? And, like, you hand-wave that away, even though that's its own problem. That at least, like, makes a little bit of sense to me, But, who has a better story than Brandon Stark? Beyond being a fucking author wank, right? Like, it's like the most nonsensical thing, because that's not even true. Like, half the other character, like, almost every character in the story, almost every character in that circle, maybe not every, but a lot of the characters in that circle have a better story than Brandon fucking Stark does.
Yep. Not to mention, by the way, that the person most closely associated with having a good story leading to solid leadership is Daenerys Targaryen. So, how good is that logic gonna get you?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it is mind-blowing that is where they kind of like ended up. And and this isn't to say that I don't think Bran would be a good king. I'm sure he'd be fine or whatever, and I want the best for the realm or what, fine, sure, or whatever. But just like in terms of
I'll fucking challenge that, because this is
you're really
this is something that aggravates me, because everything that everybody throws out about why Bran would be a good king are reasons why Bran would be a great advisor to the king, right? Like, we consistently see that part of the secret sauce to making a good king is like some aspect of compatibility with the people and charisma, and Bran explicitly has none of that, right?
Yeah.
Bran's the perfect archmaester, maybe, right? Maybe the perfect master of whispers or whatever. He is not a good king, not by any stretch of the imagination, and it just aggravates me that this is the way they went with it. I think that I can see a world where, again, pacing, right? Like, if they had built this the right way, it might have made sense. But it just also goes against everything that Bran even says that he's about. I'm not Bran Stark anymore. I can't be the Lord of Winterfell. I'm the Three-Eyed Raven. Apparently doesn't disqualify you from being the king, right? And it's just. I couldn't. I hadn't been following any of the leaks, so I wasn't prepared for any of this.
Yeah, me neither.
So when it happened, I was just like, "Are you fucking kidding me?"
Yeah. So what I thought was going to happen was Tyrion was going to pitch a couple, and we were going to end up on one of the kind of generally acceptable. He was going to go, "Who has a better story than Bran the Broken?" But yada yada yada. But then there's also Arya the assassin, yada yada yada, and then there's Sansa the fucking whatever, yada yada yada, and then it would kind of it's like a multiple choice question a little bit, and they would actually do a little deliberation, but instead Tyrion walks up, pitches Bran, everyone says yes, meeting over, right?
Not only that, but he walks up, starts to talk, and Grey Worm tells him to shut up, and he says, "Okay, but," and then pitches him anyway.
See, I actually think that the break between episode 5 and 6 should have happened essentially there, right? I think the dramatic question that we should have left the weekend with was Tyrion going, "Well, we're all the most powerful lords and ladies of Westeros. It is up to us to decide who is the next king." Ba-bum, credits, right? And then you would come in next week, and next week would just be deliberations where Sansa goes, "I'm a really effective administrator," and Bran goes, "I can fucking see weirwood trees," and Arya goes, "I'm a assassin," and then somebody goes, "Well, Jon Snow would be a good king," and then Grey Worm goes, "No, fuck Jon Snow, he killed Daenerys." You know what I mean? We would actually have some back and forth with some of this stuff. Instead, we just kind of get a little bit of a hand wave that Grey Worm and the Unsullied, and assumedly the Dothraki, who just don't show up again, I guess, for the rest of this series. God, they really did the Dothraki dirty too, right? They had control of Jon and enough they had enough leverage over the realm that they could insist that Jon be punished and not end up on the throne and be taken seriously. Just all of the pieces of this I feel were completely botched, and then the ending to this whole affair was that Bran ends up on the throne, and it makes god-awful zero sense. This isn't even getting into the issue where Sansa just looks over at Bran and says, "Hey, I know you're my brother, and I've been talking about how we Starks need to stick together, but I'm actually going to go be the Queen of the North." Fuck you, Bran. And then Bran just accepts it. And these other...
Dorne and the Iron Islands who are who should have been at that point I would also like to be independent. Thank you. We hear nothing from them. I might have been more okay with Bran being king if this was not like a happy thing that everybody thought was a good idea. If this was like a tense moment where, no one can agree, but this is the best thing we're going to agree to because he's a weird autist in a chair that seems pretty smart, right? Like, we'll deal with this for now, and this is the tenuous piece that will hold the Seven Kingdoms together, right? Like, like that ending, I still wouldn't have thought was as good as anything else, but it would have been much better than what we got, right? Like I could have bought that, right? Like, or like, there's 1,000 ways to make it even better than that. But like, even if you shift the motivation that much, right? Like that it's just kind of like the thing of convenience rather than like the great idea that everybody signed on to enthusiastically. Like, I don't, yeah. I just can't, I can't even.
I also think that plays into the kind of downer ending that I'm pitching for some of these other characters like Arya and like Tyrion, right? A world in which maybe your top liners are all dead or whatever, and you have to kind of like pick up the pieces, and it's left to the Davoses and the Gendrys, you know what I mean, to like make their voices heard and kind of come to a compromise solution. I feel like that would make a lot more sense than what we got, which was essentially, I mean, this is the other part that gets to me, because it's not just that Bran ends up on the throne, but that Tyrion is positioned as unequivocally kind of like the kingmaker in the scenario, right? Tyrion pitches Bran on like the most weak sauce speech about fucking narrative ever. Like, seriously, like my middle school English teacher gave me this speech about why it was important to read Catcher in the Rye, right? And then everyone agrees to it and says yes, and then Bran says, well, you're actually going to do the ruling for me, Tyrion, instead of like, pay for any of the mistakes that you made. Somehow paying for the mistakes is just by being in the same position, but even more powerful and with even more influence. It just boggles my mind. And I think part of that is unfair, because I definitely do subscribe to the series where, like, Tyrion got brain neutered in order to, satisfy the whims of the plot in the latter half of, the show. And that's true, right? But it also, those things definitionally, fundamentally happened. Tyrion enabled the woman who burned King's Landing to the ground and turned 1 million people into ashes. He was her hand, right? How on earth does he get away scot-free? Not even scot-free, but he gets like a good ending, right? I don't know.
And like I can see the keep doing this. You could see like the better version of this where like Tyrion's bound to become the Varys because Varys is dead, right? Like the quintessential servant of the realm that must, that works for the better of the realm as penance for his crimes, essentially. But it doesn't feel like that. And then we get like 4 minutes of him rearranging chairs in another bad
and this is another piece of it, because this is part of his speech to Jon, right? Like, I mean, how many daggers can my Danny Lovingheart take from Tyrion in that one fucking scene? Something he says to Jon is, I tried to control her, but I couldn't. But if you actually look at the series, right, like you look at what happened and their interactions, Danny has not done much else besides follow his advice. The thing that he is best at, right, as Hand of the Queen, is convincing Danny to go with his plans. Plans that inevitably are pretty awful. Outside of allying with Jon, which I do think is a real achievement, and he doesn't really get credit for it, but like outside of, creating the alliance between Danny and Jon that would eventually save the realm from the Night King and everything like that, Tyrion whiffs with Dorne and with the Reach. Tyrion is the one who thinks that Danny should negotiate with Cersei multiple times, end over end. He continually appeals to this idea that Cersei loves her kids and therefore she will be a good woman, and she continually lets him down, but they just keep repeating this cycle, and she follows his advice through this. And then his final denouement with Jon about Daenerys is, I never really could control her. She was too wild and crazy for me. It's like, no, the only time she didn't listen to your advice was once at the very end. Like it's crazy. It's crazy that that's the world that we live in.
So if I'm going to play devil's advocate, it's a little bit more than that. He also asks her to not burn the Tarleys, and she does. Like, there are moments earlier in the series.
Sure, yeah, no,
a little,
that is fair.
Where he, like, advises moderation, and, you get these little flecks of, like, her being a little bit crazy. But, you're mostly right? Like, that he does, for the most part, have her ear and, does his job all right. And honestly, what I would have liked to have seen out of him in this series was, like, him continue, like, before the finale, like, is him make a bunch of decisions, and some of them turn out well, but every time it's something to do with Cersei, it fails because, like, that's his fatal. Like, I think this is what it's supposed to be, right? Like, his fatal flaw is his softness for his family, even with Cersei, who hates him immeasurably, right? Like, I think this is a lot more convincing with his softness for Jaime. And, like, that to be his kind of, like, ultimate Achilles heel is he can't fully sell out his family. And
even that I felt like was not appropriately paid off.
Oh yeah,
in a way. Like, he just miraculously finds their bodies or whatever, even though it just, like, doesn't make any sense. But fine, whatever. He finds their bodies and he kind of, like, cries for a second. But there's, like, and I can't tell if this is, like, good show don't tell, or, like, no, please tell, like, this is not good enough. Because Tyrion directly led to the death of his brother, right? If Tyrion does not free his brother from the Unsullied, his brother is alive right now. But instead, he sent his brother into King's Landing, and Jaime died, right? That, I was like, that was something I was expecting to pay off big, right? Like, when I was still expecting Bronn to eventually double-cross Tyrion, and, like, the ending for Tyrion is he was going to die, I was like, oh, this is going to be a piece of it, right? Bronn is going to show up with the crossbow, and Tyrion's going to be like, I fucking deserve this. If it wasn't for me, Jaime would still be alive. I got my brother killed. I got my sister killed. I got all of these people in King's Landing killed. And now I deserve to die. And Brian's like, yep. And then that's, like, the end of it, or whatever. This is his, like, tragic thing. But they never touch on it at all, right? And it's just like, did Tyrion just get over it? I guess he just got over the fact that he caused, like, the only person in his life that he really truly loves, right, anymore. He just gets over that person's death. Okay, sure, fine. Even though he's the one that directly caused that death, whatever, it's fine. I don't know if that seems rough to me. That seems a little nitpicky, but
I think the problem. This is again, it's a pacing problem, right? Like, I think that, a better paced final X number of episodes of the show has time for that to breathe, and for him to feel like shit, and, like, for that to, like, have real weight on him. But we get, like, 3 seconds of him smashing rocks, and then we're on to the next scene.
Yeah. There's other big giant characters we haven't really talked about that much. I feel like she gets probably the happiest ending, though I still find it baffling for some of the reasons we've already talked about, is Sansa, right? She ends up Queen of the North, okay. First of all, I think that's stupid, because if she declares independence, why don't all these other people? But the other thing that I found very weird was that the reasoning that she gave was, like, the Southern Wars. But the Southern Wars were all the North doing that to itself, essentially, right? Robb led the Northmen south and got killed at the Red Wedding. Jon led the Northmen south and they successfully sacked King's Landing, I guess. I don't know. Like, they did is that bad for the North? And so she declares independence, which is her stated goal this entire time. So that makes sense. But I just don't feel like that doesn't make... I guess it is nice that she got the ending that she wanted, but it just didn't seem to kind of, like, make sense in the overall positioning of the show itself.
So I think that this is... I think of all the endings that her ending is probably the best. I think that the primary problems with Sansa's ending aren't necessarily problems with her ending stuff, although you have identified a couple of problems. I think it's with the other things surrounding it. And if you fix those problems, like, if instead of it's just Sansa declaring independence, right, like, the whole kingdom fractures into a more federated thing, and the king's like whole, is like a figurehead or something, or or something like that, right? Like then Sansa being the queen makes a lot more sense, right? And I think taken in isolation, Sansa being queen of the North is probably the best justified ending of any of any of the endings. It's just that the mechanisms to which she gets there just doesn't like fit in. Like the North's independence doesn't make sense in the context of the rest of the decisions. But I think that her ending, like that whole kind of narrative drive makes sense if somehow you I'm probably not explaining this well, but if somehow you divorce it out, I think it's
right. Someone basically said like on the subreddit, they were kind of like, the ending makes sense because it fulfills sort of like the final wish of the Starks, right? After Ned Stark is killed in King's Landing, Robb declares independence, and so she is doing right by her family of, Robb and later Jon, by kind of like fulfilling their legacy of this independence that they have declared for themselves ever since the death of Ned. That is the most convincing argument I've seen in why Sansa is doing what she's doing, but again, it isn't made inside of the context of the episode. So there's a couple of pieces of that where we sort of have to make arguments extra textually in order to make it work. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I guess this is it. This is the end of Game of Thrones. This is the part that kills the worst, is that it's like, it's over. This is maybe the feeling I was holding on to most often, which was just this like unearned optimism of the show, where I was like, hey, listen, they got time to turn it around. So what? Dorne was a little bit shaky. Hardhome was a fucking bop. Let's see what they do next episode, like next season or whatever. Oh, like, this stuff with Dany and Jon in season 6 is great. Who cares if, there's like fast traveling, and the Battle of the Bastards is kind of the same battle we've seen 3 times already. And then, season 7 was filled with Tyrion making dumb decisions for no reason, and bad plan just makes absolutely no sense. But wasn't it just so great to see like Fellowship of the White? Like, come on, they'll bring it in the end. And then they just... They didn't bring it in the end.
So, I'm going to ask you the question that I've asked you, I think at least 4 times before on this podcast. Do you think we get a Game of Thrones Brotherhood at some point?
I mean, is the books the Game of Thrones Brotherhood at this point?
Well, it would be that the books would finish, and then then you would go remake the later seasons of the show, or like entire show, right? Again,
I think
with following closer to the books,
and I think it will absolutely happen 30 or 40 years from now. It'll be like remakes of other, remakes of other stuff, and I bet it will be worse. In a lot of ways, because as most of these kind of like the Lethal Weapon TV show is like not great, or like when they bring Columbo back for the 80th time, or Knight Rider back from the 80th time, it'll be like not great. I do think Game of Thrones has kind of like become a Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Battlestar Galactica, right? Like, I mean, hey, Battlestar Galactica, that's a great example of one where they nailed it, right? They brought Battlestar Galactica back and it was great. And so, maybe we get a Battlestar Galactica TV show. I'm sorry, a Game of Thrones TV show that does it right and is more sort of like dedicated to itself, sort of like 30 years from now when we're 50, right? And we're talking to our kids about like seeing seeing Game of Thrones when it aired on our television set, because now we watch everything in like VR headsets that are like screwed into our brains.
Yeah, and Kit Harington's Ned Stark in this one.
Yeah. Oh man, 100%. Something like that absolutely happens. Like,
So yeah. So you think there's any chance at all that, like, let's say just for sake of argument, George R. R. Martin gets his shit together and he finishes Winds of Winter by next summer, and then like within a couple of years he gets the last book done. You think there's any chance we get like an alternate route? Last, say, 4 seasons or so.
No way. I don't think there's any way that I don't think there's any way that happens. I don't think that there's any way that if I'm Kit Harington, why on earth would I agree to that? Do you know what I mean? Like you're a bona fide movie star at this point.
Yeah, fair
going
enough.
out and making bona fide movies. You don't have to. I don't know.
So's Sophie Turner? Is that the Dark Phoenix lady?
Yeah. Man, she's in superhero movies now that are going to be awful.
I'm excited.
I'm actually a little bit excited too. These trailers have kind of like hyped me up for how bad I think it's going to be.
Well, we'll have to see, I guess. But I think that's about it. Unless you had any other thing you wanted to talk about.
What are your thoughts on the overall season? Like, what was your favorite episode this season?
The one that everybody agrees is best because it was written by somebody else. I think it was the second one.
Okay. See, that's interesting because I actually think my favorite episode might be the Battle of Winterfell, which is part of the Game of Thrones thing that is hard to parse in a way. As the quality of the writing has undoubtedly gotten worse, which is true, and it has, and we've talked about a lot of those kind of mistakes as they've come up. I actually think that the quality of the filmmaking has really gone through the roof, right? Like these guys are hiring the best dudes in their field and they're shooting, like the best film. And so because the Battle of Winterfell was the least written, if that makes sense, and the most filmed, it is kind of like by default the best episode of the season. Though I do have to say I did like A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which is really funny because it's written by a guy that everybody fucking loathes. Have you heard like Unbound, Unbent, Unbroken? Do you know that episode in season 5?
Which one is that?
It's the episode where Jaime and Bronn fight the Sand Snakes in Dorne. It is widely regarded as the worst episode in Game of Thrones pre-season 8, right? And like, everybody hates Dorne, and they hate Dorne, and this episode is like the pinnacle of it, and it's written by a guy named Brian Cogman, and everybody wanted, Brian Cogman to be fired, and they thought that he was like awful and garbage, and I thought it was incredibly hilarious and poetic that the best episode of season 8 in terms of its writing was written by him.
Fair enough.
Like the ultimate revenge for my boy Brian, right? Like coming out of the woodwork. This is exhausting to talk about.
Yep, it's like this just reminds me of the Last Jedi episode.
Yeah, that's fair. It does remind me a lot of The Last Jedi. Though, see, I've actually seen other people make that kind of comparison. But first of all, I haven't really seen too many people defending the season 8 of Game of Thrones.
So I will say that our boy Vito, who is the guy who made one of those The Last Jedi like takedowns, released a video yesterday that was like, is Game of Thrones Season 8 as bad as The Last Jedi? And his answer is no. So,
wow.
This is the best defensive Season 8 I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a couple of takes kind of related to this, right? Like, some people will say things like, see, what they did to Dany is like what they did to Luke Skywalker and stuff like that. And, all of that stuff, boy. My problem with that is that, like, even if you don't agree with this, there is, I think, a kind of a logical interpretation of The Last Jedi. This is my interpretation of The Last Jedi, right? Where you focus in on the Luke stuff and the Rey stuff, and you just kind of ignore Canto Bight. You just kind of shoot. And you kind of, like, ignore Admiral Holdo. It's whatever. That Luke stuff was so good. You know what I mean? Like, there's something really good to grab onto and really, like, touching and, like, meaningful. And I can point to that thing and latch onto it and just kind of forgive the rest of it. I feel like season 8 of Game of Thrones doesn't have that, and it doesn't have that for that pacing reason, right? Basically, everybody gets fucking massacred. It feels like by this sort of relentless roller coaster speed, takeoff of the story of the show. So I just don't feel like there is anything to kind of like latch onto and be like, well, at least this thing happened because kind of everybody was ruined in the end. Like nobody got away from the bad writing scot-free, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I will say that I think that that The Last Jedi is better than the end of this show. Obviously, there's some, I am not a Last Jedi hater. You definitely are, and I'm just kind of like down on it. But I thought that this was much worse, much worse.
Oh yeah. No, I agree with you 100%. It was much worse. Have you like followed other TV shows all the way to their like series conclusions? Does it compare to like a lot of people are comparing this to Lost, which I never watched? So
yeah, I haven't really watched a lot of prestige TV, right? I guess the closest I ever came was True Detective, and that was Anthology.
You like never saw like Breaking Bad?
No. Never saw The Wire, even though we were all supposed to, since we were living there when that happened.
Oh my God, yeah, right? God, everybody was talking about The Wire back then.
Never saw The Sopranos, even though
it's in New Jersey.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Like, my parents watched The Sopranos because it takes place all in places that they grew up.
Really?
Yeah, I think a large portion of it takes place in Fairfield, which is like where my parents grew up, where both of my parents grew up, and like where my grandparents lived. So I never watched any of that either because I was busy doing other
I never
things.
watched The Sopranos. I did finish Mad Men, which actually had to be honest with you, I think Mad Men also suffered from like kind of final season. It sucked, but the very ending of Mad Men is really great. So it kind of makes up for it. Like they really nail the ending. Though I'm not really sure if other people agree with that. I kind of watched Mad Men in a bit of a vacuum.
Yeah, I watched. What was it? The only finale I can really compare it to is the Seinfeld finale.
Which was the clip show, right?
Yeah, which was bad.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, do I think that Game of Thrones or Seinfeld had a worse finale?
Is Seinfeld still your favorite TV show?
I don't know. It's definitely one that I really love, and one that I don't subscribe to kind of like. I understand the Seinfeld syndrome thing, but I don't think that it holds up as much. Maybe that's because I grew up in it. We had enough of our lives where there weren't cell phones that cell phones could have solved most of these problems. Things. I think it still holds up. I'm going to say that I think that Seinfeld has a better finale than Game of Thrones, if only because it didn't have enough continuity to ruin.
Fair enough. Wow, that's rough.
Yeah.
What about like Futurama? Did you ever go deep on Futurama?
I watched all of it before it got rebooted or whatever happened. But that was so long ago that I don't remember enough of it to really make an argument either way.
Fair enough. Well, we are done with Game of Thrones until the fucking prequel series comes out, I guess. Which I actually am legitimately kind of hyped for. I do want to see what they do because I really like Westeros, the whole world and everything like that. And there are some indications that the prequel series will be something completely new, even outside of the context of the books, the George R.R. Martin books, which would be really interesting. I think there's a lot of cool stuff to get into with the free cities and Essos and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, the world of Westeros is definitely, or I don't know, does the whole world have a name?
It actually does, but I can't remember what it's called.
Regardless, I do think that it is in the grand tradition of fantasy authors like this. I think George R.R. Martin has made a very interesting world that you can hang a lot of other things off of in the same way that you can with Star Wars or with, say, Lord of the Rings. So
yeah, absolutely.
I could definitely be into that.
Okay, well, I guess we're done.
I guess that's it. If you would like to tell us what you thought about the end of Game of Thrones, you can reach us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@somederpsplaygames.com. Podcast@somederpsplaygames.com. Follow us at twitch.tv/somederpsplaygames. And I've forgotten about this for the past couple of weeks, but we also have a Patreon now. If you'd like to give us money for whatever reason, you could throw us some money at Patreon/somederpsplaygames. It's in the description. Leave us a review on iTunes. I I think that's everything I had. But did you have anything else that you wanted to talk about before we ended this?
Nope. I have hit on everything. We're good.
All right. And in that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.